Hi everyone, and welcome back to History Calling, where I bring you new videos every Friday delving into the stories of the past. Today we're asking the question, was Henry VIII a brain-damaged king? There have long been theories that a series of sporting accidents which occurred in the 1520s and 30s left Henry with a traumatic brain injury that led to changes in his personality and influenced his decisions during the last 11 years of his life to execute 2 wives and a litany of other relations and servants. But how compelling is the evidence for his injuries? What exactly do we know about his physical and mental state in the final portion of his life? And might there be another explanation or explanations for his increasingly tyrannical behaviour? Let's find out. The theory that Henry VIII was brain damaged gained a new lease on life in 2016 when a group of neurologists from Yale University published a short article in the Journal of Clinical Neuroscience arguing that the time was ripe to re-examine this theory because of advances in their field. This article is behind a paywall, however, if you're a university student or staff member or you know someone who is, you can access it through their library, so I'll leave a link in the description box. The authors list a number of symptoms they believe Henry had which can result from brain damage, specifically a changed personality consistent with sociopathy, memory problems, difficulties with impulse control, headaches, insomnia, and depression. They link these symptoms to 3 specific accidents, so let's look at these in more detail. The first was on the 10th of March 1524, while Henry was jousting with his brother-in-law Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. We have a detailed description of it from the chronicler Edward Hall, who writes that the men were at opposite ends of the tilt, ready to joust. Henry was handed his spear by the Marquis of Dorset, with his visor still up, while Suffolk, at the other end of the tilt, was told the king was ready to go. Suffolk couldn't see Henry, though, because his own visor was already down and severely limiting his field of vision. We can get a sense of what this must have been like by looking at this suit of armour, which actually belonged to Henry and which dates from 1527. As you can see from the helmet, with the visor down to protect his face, especially the eyes, the wearer would be almost blinded. Suffolk now set off down the field, at which point Henry, seeing him coming, did the same, but without putting his visor in place first. The spectators could see the danger and began screaming at the 2 men to halt, but neither did. Then came the impact. According to Hall, Suffolk's spear hit Henry on the brow right under the defence of the headpiece, on the very soft skull, it means a skull cap, or bassinet piece, whereunto the barbette for power and defence is charnelled. This section of helmet was designed to be protected by the visor and so was not able to withstand such a blow. Hall continues, but when the spear on that place lighted, it was great jeopardy of death, insomuch that the face was bare, for the Duke's spear broke all to shivers, meaning splinters, and bare the king's visor or barbette so far back by the contrabuff that all the king's headpiece was full of splatters. Again, he means splinters. Onlookers were horrified, and Suffolk swore never to joust against the king again, though in fact he did end up doing so. But Henry said that no one was to blame but himself, and proceeded to run a further 6 tilts that day in order that all men might perceive that he had no hurt, which was great joy and comfort to all his subjects there present. Hall also adds that if Henry had been hurt, his servants would have put the Duke in jeopardy. The fact that they didn't is further evidence that the king was unharmed. The 2016 article claims that the king was dehorsed and dazed, but Hall says nothing of the sort, and in fact this is just one of many places in which the neurologists have made mistakes in their use of the primary sources, I assume because they didn't look at them themselves and instead tried to take shortcuts by just reading some secondary works. Had Henry been seriously injured, he couldn't have gotten up, shaken himself off, conversed with Suffolk and his servants, and then ridden in 6 more jousts. Furthermore, the neurologists assert that his headaches began after this point, while others have noted that in fact these pains only began in 1528, 4 years later. I therefore don't see any connection between the two, nor is there any evidence that Henry had constant, debilitating migraines. There are sporadic references to headaches in the accounts of those who knew him, and Henry even references one himself in a letter to Anne Boleyn, but they could just as easily have been stress-induced, as the king was, by the late 1520s, trying to extricate himself from his marriage to Catherine of Aragon in order to marry Anne, and finding it a lot harder to get his own way than he'd expected. The second supposed head injury occurred in 1525. Again, the source for this is Edward Hall, who says, "In this year, the king following of his hawk leapt over a ditch beside Hitchin, with a pole, and the pole broke, so that if one Edmund Moody, a footman, had not leapt into the water and lift up his head, which was fast in the clay, he had been drowned." The neurologists say that the king may have been dazed or unconscious on the basis that he had to be pulled out of the ditch, but again, that's not what the source says, and I dislike the leap that they're making here. Henry was stuck, but it doesn't mean he'd taken a serious head blow, and there's nothing here to suggest unconsciousness. Finally, we have what is perhaps the most famous of Henry's accidents, and also the most misunderstood. This was another incident at a joust, and occurred at Greenwich on the 24th of January 1536, when the king fell off his horse. One reason this accident gets so much attention is because Anne Boleyn had a miscarriage shortly afterwards on the 29th, which she blamed on her distress at the king falling. Another reason is the description of it found in a letter written on the 6th of March by Dr. Pedro Ortiz, the Spanish ambassador in Rome to the Empress of Spain. Ortiz says that he has recently received a letter from the Spanish ambassador in France dated the 15th of February, which told him that the French king said that the King of England had fallen from his horse and been for 2 hours without speaking. La Anna was so upset that she miscarried of a son. This obviously sounds like a serious injury. The phrase "without speaking" suggests that Henry was unconscious, and the neurologists and several other medical experts who have written about his supposed injuries and personality changes have latched onto this and run with it. What they don't usually do, however, is consider the reliability of this source, or look at any other sources which contradict what Ortiz says. First, let's consider where Ortiz is getting his information. He's sitting in Rome in early 1536, getting a letter from an ambassador in France who's repeating something he heard the French king say, who presumably heard it from his ambassador in England, though we don't know for sure. It could just as easily have been gossip sent in a letter to someone else at the French court, which then made its way to the king's ears, or even hearsay coming in from English and French sailors crossing the channel for trade purposes. The ambassador who wrote the letter may even have misunderstood the French king's meaning. No matter what, this is one long chain of evidence spread across 6 weeks and half the continent of Europe, with no definitive original source. It appears entirely possible that some details of the fall have become garbled. This seems all the more likely when we look at 2 pieces of evidence which come from people who were actually in England at the time of Henry's fall and who paint a very different picture of the severity of the incident. The first is the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis. He wrote on the 29th of January that, "On the eve of the conversion of St. Paul, the king being mounted on a great horse to run at the lists, both fell so heavily that everyone thought it a miracle he was not killed, but he sustained no injury." He added a further detail in another letter to the emperor dated the 10th of February, confirming that Anne Boleyn had blamed her recent miscarriage on the Duke of Norfolk, whom she hates, saying he frightened her by bringing the news of the fall the king had 6 days before. However, once again, he downplays the seriousness of Henry's fall, writing that it is well known that is not the cause, for it was told her in a way that she should not be alarmed or attach much importance to it. Chapuis was well placed to get good first-hand accounts of Henry's health and disliked the king for his treatment of Catherine of Aragon and Princess Mary. Had Henry been seriously hurt, Chapuis would have reported it, and I think with a certain sense of glee that the king was getting his just deserts. Finally, we have the report of English herald and chronicler Charles Risley, also on the spot in London at the time. He too recorded that Anne had a miscarriage and asserted that it was said she took a fright, for the king ran that time at the ring and had a fall from his horse, but he had no hurt, and she took such a fright withal that it caused her to fall in travail, and so was delivered afore her full time. So as you can see, no one who was actually in the capital and in a position to get first-hand information about this fall set much store by it. It could have gone horribly wrong, but it didn't. All in all, therefore, I think we've established that the evidence for any serious head blows, let alone repeated ones, is very shaky indeed, while there is little evidence of a series of headaches which can be reliably attached to any fall or head blow either. But what about the rest of the symptoms, which are often tied to the claim of brain damage? Did Henry actually display these problems, and if so, might there be another explanation for them? The first is amnesia, and here the writers of the 2016 article make some serious errors. They claim that after an argument with Queen Catherine Parr in 1546, Henry ordered his sixth wife to be taken to the Tower of London, only to forget he had done so the next day when he berated those who arrived to arrest her. The Tudor historian Tracy Borman wrote an excellent response to this article in the History Today magazine, linked below, in which she mentions this claim and notes that, in fact, the warrant was part of a conspiracy led by the Queen's enemy, Stephen Gardiner, and Henry knew nothing about it until Catherine ran to him pleading for her life. One of the neurologists came back and said that he wasn't an historian and that they had read the story in a secondary source whose opinion differed from Borman's. This, gang, is a classic example of why you should always look at the primary sources yourself, and why, if you want to write an interdisciplinary article in a field far removed from your own, you need at least one of the co-authors to be an expert in that field. Had these neurologists brought a historian on board, this problem and the others I'm about to mention likely wouldn't have happened. Next up, we have the claim that Henry had impulse control issues. The neurologists offer almost no evidence for this beyond a three-word quote from a French ambassador in 1540 saying that Henry suffered from lightness and inconstancy. They make a few other unreferenced claims about his anger, paranoia and unpredictability, but I wouldn't say that being a grumpy old man and suffering paranoia in Tudor England when you've made as many enemies as Henry had are necessarily signs of a brain injury. As monarch, changing one's mind could even be read as a clever political move to keep observers on their toes and not become too predictable. As for sociopathy, all they cite here is a book by author Derek Wilson which says that the worst of the bloodletting of those close to the crown occurred after 1536. That's factually correct, but in no way conclusive evidence of a brain injury. Mary I, having never shown violent tendencies beforehand, executed a number of members of her extended family and allowed nearly 300 people to be burnt to death, all in less than 5 years. However, no one is saying that she was physically brain damaged. We also need to consider the claim that Henry went through a sudden personality change and, out of nowhere, began executing family members and friends. This is simply untrue. I've always believed when studying Henry's life that what we see is the natural evolution of a man who could be charming and magnanimous when it suited him, for instance when courting Anne Boleyn as you see here, and incredibly nasty and cruel when it didn't, and here we see Anne being executed on her husband's orders. Watch my videos on the life of Mary I for more evidence of this, to see how badly he treated her and her mother from the late 1520s onwards, because they wouldn't agree to the annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. He'd also executed one of his oldest friends and advisors, Thomas More, in 1535, before the 1536 fall from his horse. I therefore see no sudden change in his personality. This is someone who had been given almost unlimited power at the age of 17 without ever really having to work for it, who had no one in his life who could really say no to him, and who lived in a violent era when things like torture and execution were legal and common. Under such circumstances, I might actually be more surprised if he hadn't indulged in tyrannical behaviour. Moving on, the 2016 authors correctly note that Henry had periods of depression, often linked to deaths of those close to him, even if he was the one who had had them killed, as in the case of his advisor Thomas Cromwell. This seems like a normal human reaction that anyone might suffer, however. It's not linked by the scientists to any head injury, and I have to wonder why they bothered to bring it up when they seemed unable to really make anything of it. Henry was a man who'd lost most of his children, seen his wife Jane Seymour die, believed that one of her replacements, Catherine Howard, had cheated on him, who'd split with the Church in Rome despite being Catholic, and who had perhaps realised that he wasn't as important a player on the international stage as he liked to believe himself to be. Periods of melancholy are therefore hardly strange. I've already explained that the headaches started years after 2 of the supposed head injuries, and as for insomnia, even the neurologists admit that it's hard to connect this to a brain injury when dealing with someone like Henry who had chronic pain. This brings us nicely to the many other health issues the king suffered, which can account for a large number of his symptoms. Henry famously had problems with his legs, which were flaring up as early as 1527 while he was staying at Canterbury during a royal progress. Susanna Lipscomb, whose book is linked in the description box, has postulated that the 1536 fall caused a pre-existing ulcer to burst, noting that by April, just before the fall of Anne Boleyn, a courtier reported that the king goes seldom abroad because his leg is something sore, something which Henry himself confirmed that June. His leg troubles would continue for the rest of his life, and they were incredibly painful. On one occasion in 1537, he was in such agony that he was black in the face and unable to speak. Prevented from exercising as much as he used to, his suits of armour show that he had gained a massive amount of weight between 1527 and 1544, much of it after 1536, according to those who saw him in person. This pain also easily explains his irascible nature, insomnia and dark moods, while, if you want to insist that he occasionally forgot things or changed his mind suddenly, a lack of sleep could certainly lead to brain fog and impaired cognitive function, as any of us who have had a late night followed by an early morning can attest. Other modern doctors have put forward additional hypotheses to explain Henry's increasingly tyrannical behaviour and other health problems, including lead poisoning from his so-called medications, Cushing's syndrome, which is when you have too much of the hormone cortisol in your system, and the neurological disorder MacLeod syndrome. So do I think Henry VIII was brain damaged? Well, while I admit that it's almost impossible to rule out anything entirely, for all we know he was dropped on his head as a baby, for instance, I think the evidence put forward to support such a claim is very weak, and that other explanations are far more likely. Above all, it's long been my belief that Henry was essentially a nasty, spoilt individual who lacked the emotional maturity to deal with life's disappointments or recognise his own faults and limitations, instead opting to lash out at others. I think that this, more than anything else, is the main cause of the terrible things he did. What do you think, though? Let me know in the comments section if you believe the king suffered a brain injury. And while you're down there, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel with notifications switched on. You can learn more about the Tudors by going to my Tudor Monarchs series or my playlist on the 6 Wives of Henry VIII. Or for something different, why not try my video on the mystery of Skeleton Lake? I'll be back next week, and until then, keep learning.